Welcome to another episode of CPAC Now, America UnCanceled. This is Matt Schlapp, and so many of us have heavy hearts over the news that a great public servant, former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, who lived a big, great, amazing life, passed from this earth. Interestingly enough, people might not know it, but Don Rumsfeld wrote very regular checks here to the American Conservative Union. He appeared on our stage a number of times. He was really a man of American history, and of course, a man who is also controversial, even amongst Republicans and conservatives, because he had a point of view, and he expressed it constantly. I thought my wife had the best tweet yesterday that she basically said, love Don Rumsfeld or hate Don Rumsfeld. He gave the best press conferences of like any public official ever, and it's true. Because he had a quick wit and a sharp mind and a lot of passion. And we thought a perfect person to bring on CPAC Now to talk about the great life of Donald Rumsfeld would be Scooter Libby. Scooter Libby, as you know, is a senior vice president at the Hudson Institute, and he joins us here right now. Scooter, thanks for joining us on CPAC Now.
Pleasure to be here with you, Matt.
So you knew Donald Rumsfeld about as good as anyone. You certainly worked alongside him at very important moments during the Bush administration. Give us a little insight into Donald Rumsfeld, the man.
Well, he is a terrific guy. Very strong sense of humor, strong sense of integrity, honor, fair treatment for others. And he was a combative guy. He was a wrestler in high school, had hopes to be an Olympian before his shoulder popped during practice. He was a fighter pilot, and not just a fighter pilot, but he was from a Navy taking off of carriers, but he became an instructor of pilots, and then he became an instructor of the instructors of pilots. So he was a guy who didn't mind messing it up. Wrestling and being a fighter pilot are not things that encourage coming in second. So, he was a very tough guy. He was insightful, very strategic, and always willing to question himself, and to some annoyance of others, he was always willing to question them about what they were thinking.
So one of the things I loved about Don Rumsfeld is that he decided he would be a politician. And he ran for office, I believe, in the state of Illinois, and he was a congressman. And within about 20 minutes of being a congressman, he says, "What the heck am I doing in this place?" And, it wasn't for him. He seemed to be much more of a man of action.
Well, I think he was reelected. He was elected and then reelected 3 times. So he ran 4 times, if I have it right, and seemed to enjoy that sort of tussle as well. I was not around him in those days, but Gerald Ford was, and liked a lot of what he saw because he brought Rumsfeld on to be his chief of staff when the time came. So I think he was probably always raring at the bit. He was always looking for something more to do. And I think being dissatisfied with the status quo was part of his nature. He wrote a book later in life called Rumsfeld's Rules. And
Yes.
One of them, which I think he attributes to his wife's father, was if you're coasting, you're going downhill. So I think being steady in the place was not enough for him.
Well, when he spoke at CPAC a long time ago now, probably 10 years ago, he added the Rumsfeld corollary to the Washington rule that if you want a friend, buy a dog. And I'm sure you've heard this. His corollary was, make it a small one because it might turn on you, which I thought was great. Typical him. Now, I did not know him nearly as well as you did. I was somebody that didn't deal with the defense establishment when you and I were colleagues in the Bush administration. But the one thing I was very obvious, having been around him a number of times, is he was an intimidating guy. I mean, I saw people who were pretty full of themselves kind of back down a little bit when they had to go talk to the Secretary of Defense. Was that kind of part of who he was and how he operated as well?
He liked to test boundaries, I think. He had a good sense of sport, and he was a tough bureaucrat, and he was willing to push back on people and see what they had. And I think this is part of his youth and the way he developed. I know I never had trouble with him. He was always humorous, demanding, but that's what you would want in someone in those jobs. My boss knew him much better than I ever will or could, Dick Cheney, and I have immense respect for Dick Cheney, and Dick Cheney had immense respect for Don Rumsfeld and learned a lot from him.
That's an interesting relationship between Rumsfeld and Cheney, and Rumsfeld grabs Cheney and pushes him along in those Nixon 4 years, especially those 4 years, obviously, and then kind of the shoe gets on the other foot. Dick Cheney comes in to be vice president and offers up this idea for Don Rumsfeld to be the Secretary of Defense. By that point, pretty senior guy to have such a vigorous job. Do you have any insight into like how that happened? Because that's a really interesting story that George Bush went with Don Rumsfeld.
Well, I think I have some insight. As far as I could tell, it went to the best man for the job. They talked to many people, they vetted more, and in the end of the day, Don seemed to have the best, most dynamic view of what he wanted to accomplish with the department. And he was a loyal soldier for the president. And he played by the rules, like a wrestler. He would fight tough, but he would always play by the rules. And so he did his utmost best during those years, and I think he had many accomplishments.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, they were making some very tough decisions after 9/11, and I know there's this whole debate about Iraq or what should have been done differently with Iran, and I guess history will be the judge of these things. When you are a person of history that have been involved in all these big decisions, I always wonder, as they're kind of like getting on in years, do they have regrets or things they wish they would have done? I have the feeling with Don Rumsfeld, he didn't leave this earth with many regrets.
Well, Don was always one to re-question assumptions and to go look back. In his book, he actually talks about this problem in Known and Unknown, his semi-memoir. I hope you can hear me because it's raining here.
Great.
In his book, he talks about looking back at time and how historians tend to look back at events with the benefit of knowing what happened subsequently, whereas the political actors who are in the game don't. They have to make the decisions based on what they have before them. So I'm sure he would second guess himself when he had new information on these decisions. But by the time he wrote Known and Unknown, it was 2010, 2011. Iraq was turning out very well. You may recall President Obama and Vice President Biden were bragging about how good Iraq was. So that one, I think he felt all right about at that point. Afghanistan, he felt that they needed to make more progress, but I don't think he ever second guessed the need to remove the Taliban after they had hosted Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda had turned and attacked America, which I think the evidence is that the Taliban were fully understanding of. So I don't think he second guessed the need to do those things. He may have second guessed some of how things should have been. And I have to say that if someone were going to second guess Don Rumsfeld, he would have been at the front of the line to re-examine the evidence, because he was always very rigorous in saying, challenge your assumptions, go back to basics. Before the Iraq War, he famously made a list. Before the Iraq invasion, he famously made a long list of everything that could go wrong, among which was that the CIA was wrong and there would be no WMD there. But those lists and things that they considered, and they still considered it worth going ahead.
It's great, Scooter Libby, when you give the insights into the type of person Don Rumsfeld was, including his desire to scrutinize data and even rethink big decisions. And it always makes me think about the Cheney-Bush parallel. When people would learn that I worked for George W. Bush 20 years ago now, a long time ago, they'd say, oh God, he just seems like the easiest guy. He's so fun and easygoing. And they'd say, my God, have you ever worked with Dick Cheney? He seems so mean. And I used to always tell them, I was like, meetings with George W. Bush were a contact sport. And he was more aggressive than you could ever imagine. He wanted the right answers and he'd push you. And I used to say with Dick Cheney, I felt like I was in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. I felt like he was going to ask me if I wanted a cup of tea. And he was so gentlemanly and soft-spoken. I mean, he, of course, could get excited as well, but it's funny how people have misperceptions of public officials.
It is, and I think Don is among those who people had a misperception of. You didn't have to spend long with Don and his wife. I mean, that was one of the great marriages I've ever come across. Don and Joyce were high school sweethearts, got along famously, and you could see his warmth and his sense of humor in almost any setting, actually, even some of the more combative ones. But he was a very down-to-earth guy, not like most people assume. I don't know what he was like when he was, flying jets. But when he was in the Situation Room, he was forceful. He is a force of nature. But he also had a very strong sense of humor, and he was a modest guy in those ways. He just wouldn't take any grief off of people. He was willing to push them. I remember a session in which Don came in one of his habitually sort of old and slightly rumpled suits, and National Security Advisor Condi Rice noticed his suit and said, "My God, Don, you need to buy a new suit. You've worn the stripes off of that one." And Don looked down and said, I'm going to have to get Joyce to sew a few more on.
That's great. That's awesome. Well, one of the things that we're seeing in our politics today, which is disconcerting, is, obviously you have a diversity of opinion in this country. People who think these policies work, those policies work. There's a lot of disagreements in society today. When Don Rumsfeld left his service at the Department of Defense, he had a lot of hostile treatment. You had a lot of people calling him a war criminal who disagreed with the decisions post 9/11. I heard all types of stories about how he was treated here or there. Do you think we've reached this point in America where it's no longer acceptable just to have political disagreements? There seems to be this desire to really almost try to, it was almost like he was canceled before they started canceling people, and had some pretty rough treatment from folks after he left the Pentagon.
There was a fair amount of controversy over Don when he left. The surge turned Iraq around, and I think by 2011 people had calmed down a little bit. But when he left, the situation was quite dire in Iraq and also in the body politic here. Whether we're worse or not than we used to be in, say, the 19th century or other periods of the past, it's certainly worse than it was in some of the period that we knew, but there was a great deal of hatred towards Richard Nixon, for example, during Watergate and afterwards. I think it's, those of us who are optimistic and love the country tend to forget that we have extremes, and we've had them in the past. The Watts riots were a very dark period in America, the Vietnam War demonstrations. There was a lot of anger and demonization of the police and others, and of the political figures. So with a little bit of historic distance, I would say we're at the bad end of the spectrum, but I don't know if we're off the spectrum at this point.
Well, you've been a victim of this kind of cancerous political culture, and obviously you went through your own legal traumas and came out the other side, and President Trump helped you come out to the other side, and now you get to read the news where it seems like people associated with the Trump administration, people associated with his business, and the man himself. It seems like the Democrats' strategy is to continue to try to silence his voice, to cancel him, but also to go after him with criminal prosecutions. In your opinion, as someone who's been through some of this, shouldn't there be a water's edge to politics when you leave public office and you return as a private citizen? Shouldn't these political games at some point stop?
In my view, there definitely should not be criminalization of politics, neither during the period when people are in office or after the period when they leave office. I don't know the situation in which they're looking at in New York, but the notion that a prosecutor can see fame and glory ahead if he pursues someone is not new to American history. In my case, of course, there was a witness who was not more than one, not shown the evidence they needed, and that was
Yep.
used by the prosecutor. The evidence was withheld by the prosecutor, I should be clear. And eventually, when the witness found out the truth and came forward, and other misdeeds came to light, I was eventually restored to the bar, um, and President Trump then came along and pardoned me, which was very welcome, and I'm grateful for it. But the point is that a number of years are lost in there, and public voices get lost. Look at poor Ted Stevens, who was, I think the right word is, framed by the prosecution with phony evidence, with tampering with witnesses, if I recall it correctly. And he was the 50-50 vote in the Senate at the time, or the 51st vote in the Senate at the time, or the key vote, I should say, because I think it was the closure was the issue. But he was the key vote in the issue, and American history changed because a
That's right.
prosecutor went after him unfairly. Obamacare, I think, passed only because Ted Stevens wasn't there, and not just any senator. He was head of the Appropriations Committee. He had a lot to contribute still to America. And there was a wrongful prosecution of him. So I hate to see any public figure on any side of this public debate, Democrat, Republican, Independent. I don't like to see anyone who puts their name out, puts their life out of kilter in order to serve in these difficult times. I don't like to see the government go after them, certainly needlessly, gratuitously. And I think people should reflect long and deep before they continue this trend of criminalizing politics.
I try to think of you and what you went through, and you just described very quickly the unfairness of people reporting that there were lies and essentially perjury committed, and witnesses being showed non-truthful information to get to conclusions that were based on false assumptions, and somehow the process allows that. I think that's the type of information people are learning about this. And I try to think of the last prominent Democrat from an administration who kind of went through a political prosecution themselves, and I can't really think of that person. In fact, I can think of the Democrats going to great extent to try to really throttle Trump as he was running for president during his transition. Mike Flynn into the administration. Do you think one of the big problems we have is a perception of there's a set of rules and ethics rules that Republicans are expected to follow, and it's not really a mirror image for Democrats, almost like two systems where Democrats kind of get away with a lot, and Republicans basically not only get away with nothing, they can be charged with just fulfilling the service of their office.
Well, I haven't studied this, but my impression is the same as yours, that this tends to fall more heavily on Republican figures than on Democratic figures. The prosecutors have many advantages, one of which is the choice of jurisdiction. So
Yep.
if you bring an action in New York City where Donald Trump pulled very low, or in Washington, D.C., where I think President Bush's approval rating was 6% in early 2007, people tend to make decisions on issues like credibility and truthfulness based in part on how they view someone, and that's very human. And so you can get a very loaded jury, if you wish, in one of these locations. I know in my particular case, not everything comes from my case, but it's the one I know best. Out of the jury pool of 50 people, there was not one Republican. Out of the jury that was selected, there were 11 Democrats and one member of the Green Party. So it's hard to get a fair shake if you're a Republican. If people can be swayed the way the psychologists tell us they can be swayed in their judgments, that's not a great setup for a potential defendant. And I think President Trump hopefully will not have to worry about these issues, but if something does come along in New York, it's certainly going to be an issue for him.
Well, I have a real solution to this, Scooter. I think if Washington, D.C. and the Democrats are hell-bent on making the District of Columbia a state, I think they should have to forfeit their role as the capital of the country. And I think we ought to go put that in the middle of the country, because D.C. used to be in the middle of the previous size and shape of the country. And I think they ought to be right smack dab in the middle. I'm from Kansas. I kind of think that has a nice ring to it. We could even do a big city out in the middle of the country. And all these federal jurisdiction issues would be decided in purple, slightly blue, slightly red places. And you might get a jury pool that actually could give somebody like you or me a fair shake.
Well, Matt, you may have a lot of viewers who are going out to buy property in Kansas right now. I'm speculation.
I like it. I like it. I actually don't own any of that property, so I promise it's not some kind of deal to benefit me. But if I was smart, I would have already bought it all. Scooter Libby, we appreciate all the work you're doing, especially at the Hudson Institute, where you do great work. We appreciate your service to this country. I know you had some long and tough years, but I want you to know that one of the things you ought to take great pride in is the fact that over that period of time, I heard so many people say that you were a tower of strength and dignity in the middle of an absolutely unfair and ridiculous process. And we appreciate your voice in making sure that doesn't happen to more people in the future.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's very kind of you to say. When I think of strength, I think of Don Rumsfeld. He was a great man and a strong patriot. I'm sorry he's no longer with us.
Well, you gave him fitting tribute, and we appreciate you being with us on CPAC Now, America UnCanceled. We're going to be right back with more of the show after this short break.
Joe Biden would have something to say about that. But Joe Biden would have something to say about everything. You know, they say in Washington, if you want to have a friend, buy a dog. The Rumsfeld corollary to that is buy a small one, because it might turn on you.
You know?
Welcome back to CPAC Now, America UnCanceled. This is Matt Schlapp, and what a great conversation we just had with Scooter Libby. Scooter Libby is over at the Hudson Institute, and he's landed on his feet. As he said in the interview, he's back accepted into the bar, and he has his dignity and his reputation back thanks to Donald Trump's pardon, and thanks to a lot of light that's been put on the excesses of these federal prosecutors. And now Donald Trump is having to go through the excesses of a local prosecutor. And they hold all the power and all the cards. And when you're at the target of their ire, especially if it's for political reasons, it can be a really dark time. We were going to have Ambassador Robert O'Brien on the show as well. We're going to have him on next week, because I thought it would be an interesting juxtaposition to talk about Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, their view of what should be done around the globe. And it was clearly divergent from what Donald Trump talked about with his America First policies, and Robert O'Brien and Mike Pompeo and others implemented through the Pentagon and the National Security Strategic Plan for the Trump administration. I thought what was so interesting about what Scooter said was that, if Don Rumsfeld had different information, he might have made different decisions. And this is why it's so important for us to learn about our history and to teach people the mistakes and the successes that we have, so that we don't go out repeating those mistakes again. We're in a time when history is considered unnecessary, and history is considered always racist. And so we've kind of trying to delete as much of our history as possible. And it's a big, big, big problem. We need to learn from our history. And I think what's amazing is you have a lot of these left-wing voices. I have a sheet here of tweets from really nasty people on the left, celebrating the death of Don Rumsfeld, not from a religious context that he could be in a better place, but because they thought he was an evil and terrible man. One of these tweets says, "The only thing tragic about Don Rumsfeld's death is that it didn't take place in a prison cell. If you think Bill Cosby got away with atrocities, remember that Donald Rumsfeld did not die in The Hague." So what we're seeing in America, maybe we're seeing it worldwide, but I don't think so. I think we're seeing it more here, is the criminalization of political disagreements and the destruction of people you disagree with politically. There was a time on questions of national defense when the left and the right had some commonality, and that seems to be gone. And sometimes there's an inability for different types of Republicans or people on the center-right to pull together. And you can honor somebody's life and their dedication to public service, even if you disagree with almost every decision they made. Remember, it was FDR, a great, successful political Democrat, maybe a socialist, who did a great job defeating the Nazis. And so I'd love to go back to a time when we could honor somebody even when we disagree with them. So that's what we decided to do on the show today, to bring somebody on the show who has high regard for Don Rumsfeld, and who could tell us a little bit about the man. You decide what you think about him. That's the way America is supposed to work. But we're not going to be able to make good decisions if we don't even talk about it. And so we're going to keep talking about it. And of course, CPAC in Dallas is right around the corner, starting July 9th. We're going to have a great thousands of people assembled in Dallas to hear from President Trump and from others. And to tie up the show, Donald Trump was a consequential president. He did many things that put this nation back on the right course. And one of the things I'll always respect about him was the pardons he made, including the pardon of Scooter Libby. It was the right thing to do. Thanks for watching CPAC Now America Uncanceled. We'll see you in Dallas, hopefully. If not, you're going to be streaming it. I just know it. Talk to you soon.